Aisha sat on the terrace, warming her palms against a hot mug of cocoa. Her eyes were fixed on the patio where Lucky, her faithful Labrador, was playing with a rubber ball. His golden fur shimmered in the morning sun as if the warm light was encased right inside his body. Lucky wasn't just a dog. He was her arms, her legs, her protector in a world that too often felt defenseless. Aisha ran her palm over the handle of her wheelchair. Her usual morning ritual playing with Lucky in the park was always her outlet. This day was no different, or at least she thought it was. The bright winter sun was shining as Aisha drove out of the house. Lucky paced proudly beside her, leash slightly taut, as if he knew in advance where they were going. Aisha smiled. Lucky had always been like that, loyal, caring, as if he'd been made to protect her from everything bad in the world. But today there was something strange in the air. As soon as they reached the park, Aisha felt a vague tension. The birds weren't chirping as they usually did, and the passers-by seemed to be avoiding her eyes. Lucky stopped and growled softly, subtly, so that only Aisha could hear. "What's wrong, buddy?" she asked, stroking his soft head. Lucky didn't usually get anxious for no reason. Aisha moved on, trying to push away the strange feeling of unease. Lucky stayed closer than usual. His demeanor was wary, as if he sensed something beyond her perception. It was then that he came around the corner. A tall white policeman in uniform with a cold stare that froze on Aisha. Her heart beat faster. She'd had to deal with stares like that before. Stares that judged as if she was an extra on this earth. But this one was different. It was piercing, like a knife, and Aisha felt a chill run down her spine. "Your dog?" he said sharply, pointing at Lucky. His voice was low, almost threatening. Aisha swallowed. She didn't want trouble, especially with someone in uniform. "Yeah, that's my Labrador. His name is Lucky. He's my service dog," she answered, trying to keep her voice steady. The policeman stepped closer, his boots crunching on the frozen grass. Lucky was wary, teeth bared, but he stood still, protecting Aisha. A service dog. He grinned, leaning toward Lucky. Too fat for an assistant, don't you think? Or maybe he's just a burden. Aisha clenched her hands on the armrests of the wheelchair. Her heart beat like a drum, but she tried not to show fear. "He's helping me. I can't move without him," she said firmly, her voice ringing in the cold air. The policeman straightened, and his gaze grew even colder. There was a tense silence for a moment, and then he pulled sharply on Lucky's leash. Aisha tried to hold on to him, her fingers dead set on the leash, but her strength was nothing compared to his. Lucky barked, and she felt her body stiffen with helpless despair. "Let him go," she screamed. "That's my dog. What are you doing?" But the man was already heading for the edge of the cliff, pulling Lucky behind him. Aisha screamed again, her voice cutting through the silence of the morning, but it was only the beginning of the horror that lay ahead. Lucky was alert, the fur on his scruff rising. Aisha felt her palms sweat as the white policeman strode toward them with a cold, appraising stare. He looked as if he were struggling with boredom and irritation, as if the walk in the park was a drag and their meeting was just another opportunity for a show of power. "What kind of circus is this?" he threw, stopping right in front of Aisha. His hand involuntarily touched the belt where the baton hung. "The wheelchair, the dog. Aren't you drawing too much attention to yourself?" Aisha tried not to show fear, though her voice treacherously shook when she answered. "This is my service dog. He helps me." "Does it help?" The policeman snorted as if he'd heard a bad joke. "You know, girl, people like you usually stay home, not wander around the park scaring people." His words hit her like a rock in the chest. Aisha clenched her hands on the armrests of the wheelchair. She'd heard comments like this before. People who saw her presence only as an inconvenience. But this man was in uniform, and that made his words even more ominous. "I have a right to be here," she said, trying to stay calm. "I'm not scaring anyone." The policeman stepped closer, his boots crunching loudly on the gravel of the path. Lucky growled, low and warning. The policeman glanced at the dog and grinned. "Shut your dog up," he said sharply, "or I'll do it for you." Aisha felt a cold sweat run down her back. She knew she couldn't stop Lucky if he decided to protect her, but even more frightening was the expression on the policeman's face. There was no humanity in his eyes, only icy contempt. "Lucky, be quiet," she said softly, hoping her voice would calm the dog. Lucky was quiet, but his body remained tense as a taut string. "That's better," the policeman said. His gaze lingered on Aisha, her wheelchair, and then back on Lucky. "Do you think this dog is really helping you?" "No, it's just another problem for society. I'd get rid of him if I were you." His words sounded like a lash. Aisha could hardly believe her ears. Her heart beat faster, but she didn't let herself show weakness. "Lucky's my friend. He helps me every day. You have no right to say that," she said firmly, trying not to look away. "A friend?" The policeman grinned. "You know, people like you don't have friends. You're tolerated because of your disability, that's all. And this dog—" He took a step forward, and his voice became icy. "He's just an animal, and you'd better remember that." Aisha felt her fingers begin to tremble. She realized that the situation was getting out of control, but she didn't know what to do. The policeman was no longer just a man standing in front of her. He had become a threat, intimidating, sinister, and his power made his actions even more frightening. Lucky growled again, and the policeman reached sharply for his leash. "I'll show you what to do with dogs like that," he said, and Aisha realized that the nightmare she had been so afraid of was just beginning. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're hearing our stories from, and whether you've had something similar happen in your life. We'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the sequel. And now we continue. "So," the policeman said, leaning closer to Aisha. His face was so close that she could see the wrinkles crossing his forehead. "Tell me, how did you end up here? Who gave you permission to walk in this park?" His voice was oily, with a hint of implicit threat. Aisha instinctively squirmed in her wheelchair, trying to keep her composure. "I don't need permission," she said firmly, though her voice trembled. "This is a public place." The policeman grinned, his teeth gleaming in a sinister smile. "A public place," he interjected. "This is a place for normal people. And you, girl, don't look like someone who belongs here." Aisha felt anger mixed with despair rise to her throat. She took a deep breath, trying to keep her composure. Her hands, resting on the armrests of the wheelchair, trembled. "You have no right to say that," she said. "I have the same rights as you." "License?" The policeman snorted, circling her stroller like a predator looking for prey. "Are you sure you know what a license is? Who gave you such thoughts? Maybe this friend of yours?" He pointed to Lucky, who stood nearby watching the man's every move tensely. The policeman stopped and stared at the dog with obvious contempt. "That monster is a nuisance, a useless parasite." Do you realize he does nothing for you? It just eats your money and takes up space." Aisha felt her heart clench. Lucky growled louder, and his body tensed, ready for defense. She knew he understood the words, that he sensed her fear and wanted to help. "Lucky's my rock," she said, trying to sound confident, though she was trembling inside. "He does more than you can imagine. He saves me every day." "Saves the day?" The policeman snorted. "No, girl, nobody saves people like you. Your days are spent waiting for someone to do the work for you. You know you're a burden. Your existence is an unnecessary problem for everyone around you." Those words hit harder than she expected. Aisha felt tears start to come to her eyes, but she forced herself to hold them back. She didn't want to give him this victory. "I'm living my life," she said through gritted teeth, "and you humiliate me just because you can. It makes you weak." The cop froze for a second, then smirked and leaned toward her. "Weak?" he whispered. "No, the weak one here is you. You're in a wheelchair, your dog's a useless animal, and you're a mistake of nature." Aisha couldn't listen any longer. Her breathing quickened, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the world around her. She squeezed Lucky's leash, feeling his warmth and support. "You're wrong," she said quietly, "and you know it." But the policeman had already taken a step back and, smirking, said, "We're going to check it out now." The words sounded like a promise of trouble. Lucky growled again, and Aisha realized the situation was out of her control. "Keep your dog away, or I'll take care of this myself," the policeman said, standing over Aisha. His hand jerked forward, grabbing Lucky's leash. "No!" Aisha shouted, gripping the leash with all her might. Her fingers clutched at it, but her strength was insignificant against its raw power. The policeman jerked the leash from her hands. The belt burned the skin on her palms, but it was nothing compared to the terror that came over her. Lucky, feeling threatened, began to bark and resist, but the man held him with an iron grip. "Let him go, please!" Aisha screamed. She pushed the wheels of the wheelchair, trying to get closer to him, but her movements were slow and helpless. The policeman, ignoring her, walked toward the edge of the cliff. His steps were confident, determined, as if he were doing something quite ordinary. Lucky wriggled, trying to break free, but his efforts were futile. "Stop! What are you doing?" Aisha's voice tore through the air, full of pain and despair. She struggled to reach his humanity. "That's my dog. My life depends on him. Please, please." But he didn't even look back. His face was motionless, his eyes cold as ice. "Your life?" he said with a smirk. "It's a dog. And if you think your life depends on such garbage, then maybe you should think about what you're doing on this earth." Aisha felt her body shake with impotent rage. Her words rushed through the air, but they didn't reach him. She called to him again and again, tried to convince him, pleaded with him, but he was deaf. "Lucky!" she screamed. "Please don't touch it. It can't stand it." The policeman stopped at the edge of the cliff. For a moment he turned and looked at her, but there was no regret in his eyes. On the contrary, his face radiated satisfaction, as if he took pleasure in her suffering. "Maybe this will teach you to respect authority," he said calmly, and, in one motion, tossed Lucky aside. The world froze for Aisha. She watched her faithful friend's body disappear over the edge of the cliff, heard his last bark echoing in the silence. Her heart tore as if someone had ripped it from her chest. "No!" Her scream cut through the air, full of pain and terror. She pushed the wheels of her wheelchair toward the cliff, but she was powerless to change anything. Her hands shook. Her eyes filled with tears that blinded her. She screamed, but no one came to help her. The policeman turned away indifferently and left without a word. Aisha was alone, standing on the edge of the cliff. Her body shook with sobs, her soul screamed in pain. Lucky had been her everything, her only friend, her support in this cruel world. And now he was gone. Aisha froze in place, her gaze fixed on the cliff. She couldn't believe what had just happened. Lucky, her faithful Labrador, her only support in this world, had disappeared over the edge. One thought pounded in her head. This was impossible. She kept telling herself over and over again that this was a dream, a terrible nightmare from which she was about to wake up. But reality was merciless. Her scream filled the air, tearing through it like lightning. It wasn't just a scream. It was the cry of a soul losing its most precious possession. Aisha pushed the wheelchair to the edge of the cliff, her fingers frantically clenching the wheels. She knew it was useless, but she had to try, had to at least see what was left of Lucky. The policeman stood a few paces away, looking at her with an indifference that fueled the fire of hatred in her heart. "You killed him," she screamed, her voice shaking with pain and rage. "You killed him. How could you?" He shrugged as if it didn't matter. "It's just a dog," he said with a cold chuckle. "And frankly, people like you don't belong in this world with or without it." Aisha gasped at those words. Each one of them was like a blow to the heart. She couldn't believe that a man could be so cruel. This policeman, who was supposed to protect her, had shown the worst of human nature. You're a monster," she whispered, barely finding the words. His face remained motionless. Only his eyes gleamed for a moment, as if he were enjoying her suffering. "Monster?" he interjected, tilting his head. "I just do what I have to do, taking trash off the streets." With those words, he turned and headed away, his figure disappearing into the distance like a shadow, leaving behind only coldness and terror. Aisha sat at the edge of the cliff, her breathing confused and her face covered with tears. She called out again, "Lucky, Lucky, come back. Please come back to me." But there was no answer. Only the echo of her voice echoed off the rocks. There was not a soul around. No one who could hear her screams. No one to stop this nightmare. She looked down, her gaze sliding over the rocks that went far down into the misty gorge. There, down there, lay Lucky, but she couldn't see him. Her heart was breaking with pain and helplessness. She called out to him again and again, but there was no answer. "Why?" she whispered. "Why did this happen?" Her voice trembled and something in her chest felt like it was tearing. She was alone, abandoned by a world that had always been cruel to her. Aisha lowered her head, her arms hanging helplessly from the wheelchair. The world around her continued to move, but for her, time stopped. This moment, the moment when everything was taken away from her, would remain in her mind forever. Aisha sat at the edge of the cliff, her hands resting helplessly on the armrests of her wheelchair. The wind whipped at her face, tangling her hair, but she didn't notice. Her gaze was fixed on the abyss where Lucky had disappeared a few minutes ago. Lucky, her faithful friend, her only support in this world. Lucky. Her voice shook, the words drowned in the sound of the wind. She called again, louder, "Lucky, answer me, please." But instead of answering, her voice echoed back to her, rudely reminding her of the emptiness. She knew she couldn't hear him, but she couldn't stop. She called out to him again and again, as if his life depended on her words. Her whole being was torn with pain. Lucky was more than a dog to her. He was her family. When the world turned its back on her, when people turned their eyes away or hurled insults, Lucky was always there for her. He never judged, never pitied her, just loved her. Why? Why him? She whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. Her voice was quiet, almost inaudible. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was good, the best. But there was no answer. Only the cold wind stroked her face as if trying to comfort her. The wind was the only witness to her pain, her loneliness. She closed her eyes, her hands gripping the edges of the wheelchair tightly. Memories flashed before her mind's eye. Lucky bouncing happily at the door, greeting her after a long day. There he is, laying his soft head on her lap as if he understands her sadness. Here he runs through the park, his golden fur shining in the sun. These memories tore at her heart, turning grief into unbearable pain. But along with the memories, the words of the policeman entered her mind. His voice, cold and indifferent, echoed in her head. People like you. His words ignited a fire of rage in her. He saw her only as trouble, trash. He didn't even see her as a person, and Lucky was not a friend to him, but a parasite. Aisha felt rage rising inside her. She gripped the armrests of her wheelchair tightly. She had been a silent victim for too long. She had been ignored, humiliated, looked down upon. And this cop who was behind Lucky's death was the embodiment of all the injustice she'd faced all her life. She raised her head, her face wet with tears, but there was a gleam of determination in her eyes. I won't forget, she whispered, her voice trembling but growing stronger with each word. You thought you could erase us, but I'll make you remember. Aisha was alone on the edge of the cliff, but her heart was no longer empty. Something new, unquenchable burned there. It was her anger, her love for Lucky, and her desire for justice. And though the echoes of pain still lingered, she knew she wouldn't stop until she got the truth. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're hearing our stories from, and whether you've had something similar happen in your life. We'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the sequel. And now we continue. News of the incident in the park quickly spread, thanks to a bystander who recorded part of the scene on his phone. The video of the police officer ripping the leash out of Aisha's hands and then disappearing with Lucky at the edge of the cliff went viral. People all over the city were shocked. It seemed that finally the truth would prevail, and those who should be protecting but instead abused their power would be punished. But the reality turned out to be much more complicated. The day after the tragedy, Aisha woke up with a feeling of emptiness. Her wheelchair stood motionless by the window, and her heart ached at the silence that enveloped her home. Lucky had always greeted her in the morning, with a soft bark or the warm touch of his head. Now he was gone. She sat watching the video that had gone viral online. Each viewing was like a new blow, but along with the pain, hope grew in her. Society would not stand idly by. Toward evening, a reporter came to her door. Aisha, though she felt vulnerable, agreed to be interviewed. She told her story, describing the policeman, his brutality and humiliation. She spoke of Lucky as a family member, tears streaming down her cheeks. The journalists published the story, and the next day Aisha's name was on everyone's lips. People began to demand justice. Activists took to the streets holding placards with her name and Lucky's image. It seemed that the truth was about to prevail. But the system resisted. A few days later, Aisha received a summons for questioning. She arrived at the police station feeling like she was on trial. She was surrounded by uniformed men, their gazes prickly and wary. The interrogating officer did not give her time to calm down. "Tell me what happened," he began, not looking at her but leafing through the papers. His voice was as cold as the winter wind. Aisha began to talk, trying not to miss a single detail. She told about the walk in the park, about the policeman's words, about how he had snatched Lucky's leash and thrown him down. But she was interrupted. "Are you sure you didn't provoke the officer?" the man asked, looking up. His eyes were filled with skepticism. "Maybe you said something that might have caused him to react." Aisha froze. Provocation? Is her existence in a wheelchair already a provocation? Is defending her dog, her life, a provocation? "No," she answered firmly. "I didn't do anything to provoke him. He attacked us for no reason." The officer curled his lips, making a notation on the paper. His subsequent questions were even more humiliating. "Why did you walk in this park? Do you know that this place is frequented by families? Perhaps your behavior might have seemed strange or frightening." Aisha felt her cheeks flush with anger. "Frightening?" she repeated, struggling to hold back tears. "I was just walking my dog. This is a public place." "A public place," the officer hummed, lowering his gaze to the papers again. "Perhaps, but didn't you think that the incident might have happened because you present an unusual picture? A woman in a wheelchair with a large dog. Not everyone takes it calmly." Those words were like a knife plunged straight into her heart. He was saying that her existence, her simple right to be in the park, was a provocation. Aisha tried to hold on, but she could feel the system baring its iron teeth at her. The next day, a police statement was released on the local news. They said they had launched an internal investigation, but added that Aisha's behavior could be construed as provocative. It was also claimed that the officer may have had circumstances that justified his actions. Aisha watched the newscast with a stone face. She heard the commentators talking about the problem of service dogs, the difficulty of police work, and an acceptable mistake. No one mentioned Lucky as a living being. No one mentioned her pain. She realized the system was not on her side. In the following days, she began receiving threats. Anonymous letters and social media posts called her insolent, a parasite, and a liar. Some claimed she was using her disability to get her money out. Others accused her of making the police officer look like a monster. But Aisha knew one thing. She would not give up. Those who took to the streets fought for her. Those who saw Lucky as more than just a dog. And, most importantly, she knew the truth was on her side, even if the system refused to see it. Aisha sat in her small room, surrounded by papers, notes, and newspaper clippings. Silence seemed to be her only ally in this battle, but it wasn't. Outside her house, a storm was brewing. People began to speak, loudly and forcefully, demanding answers. Her story had inspired many, but for her, this wasn't just a fight for justice. It was a battle for Lucky, for his memory, and for the right to exist in a world that had so often rejected her. The first step in this struggle was taken by Jason, a young activist from a local human rights organization. He arrived at Aisha's house the day after she received another threatening letter. His eyes burned with determination, and his voice was firm when he said, "We're not going to let them get away with this. What happened to you is not just a tragedy. It's a symptom of a system that thinks people like you are superfluous. We will fight with you." Aisha listened to him, and something inside her came alive. She had long felt alone, lost in a world where her wheelchair and her dark skin made her an object of scorn. But now she saw that she was not alone. Jason and his team started organizing rallies. People took to the streets with placards with pictures of Aisha and Lucky on them. They chanted her name, demanding justice. The reporters started asking questions again, and each time the authorities tried to dodge, the crowd only grew louder. But the fight didn't end there. New evidence surfaced. It turned out that the same policeman who dumped Lucky had already been involved in other scandals. An elderly woman told how he had insulted her for not speaking English. A young boy, a black student, said an officer humiliated him on the street by frisking him for no reason. These stories began to add up to a picture of systemic racism and abuse of power. Aisha, despite her fear and fatigue, agreed to speak at one of the rallies. She sat in her wheelchair in front of the crowd, her voice shaking, but her words penetrated hearts. I always knew that being a black girl in a wheelchair meant being invisible to many, but I didn't know it meant being the enemy to those who were supposed to protect us. Lucky was my friend, my family, and he was only killed because someone deemed us unworthy of this world. The crowd broke into applause, and Aisha felt her heart fill with warmth. She was not alone. People stood side by side, holding hands, supporting each other. However, the struggle was not easy. The authorities began to build up pressure. Police tried to disrupt rallies by dispersing crowds and arresting activists. News articles began to appear discrediting Aisha, claiming she was distorting the facts. But each time they tried to break her, she found the strength to continue. One of the key moments was the day when a prominent human rights lawyer came to town. He took Aisha's case under his care and stated at a press conference, "This case is not just about one woman and her dog. This case is about everyone who suffers from bias, violence, and indifference. We will get justice." The trial began a few weeks later. The hall was filled with people who had come to support Aisha. The police officers who had previously ignored her openly now sat back, avoiding her gaze. Every day was a challenge, but every day she felt people's support. When witnesses began to speak, the truth became impossible to ignore. The lies the system had been covering up were crumbling under the pressure of the facts. Aisha saw the walls that held her back begin to crack. Her pain, her anger, her love for Lucky all became weapons she used to push her way to the truth. But this struggle was not just for her. It was a struggle for those who could not speak, for those whom the system continued to suppress. Aisha knew that her battle was not over, but she felt that every day she was getting closer to justice. The whole city held its breath as Aisha's case reached its peak. It was no longer just a case of abuse of a disabled girl and her service dog. It became a symbol of the fight against a system that for years had turned a blind eye to abuses of power, racism, and discrimination. Aisha sat in her wheelchair in court, surrounded by journalists, lawyers, and activists. Her heart was racing, but she kept her head held high. Her anger and pain turned to determination. She would not let this man, this policeman, get away with it. The trial began with an open statement from her lawyer. His voice was firm, like a hammer smashing a stone. This case is not just about the tragic death of a dog. It's about a system that allows police officers to abuse their power, humiliating and oppressing with impunity those who should be under their protection. Today, we will show that the truth will always find a way to come out. The first days of the trial were full of tension. The police officers who defended their colleague assured that he had acted within his authority, and that Aisha had allegedly behaved aggressively. Their testimony sounded strained, but the system seemed to be on their side. But that all changed when activists and journalists stepped in and began their own investigation. They dug deeper than anyone could have expected. And soon the truth began to emerge. Aisha will never forget the day her lawyer presented the first evidence to the court. They were internal police reports that had previously been kept top secret. These documents contained complaints against the very officer who had killed Lucky. It was all there. Accusations of racism, beating detainees, insulting women. These complaints had been hushed up for decades, simply put aside to avoid tarnishing the department's reputation. When the defense lawyer began to read out the evidence, the courtroom froze. One complaint was from an elderly black woman who claimed that the same officer ripped her bag off, called her a useless old woman, and threatened to put her in jail if she got smart. Another complaint was from a young Latina woman whom he allegedly humiliated on the street by calling her an illegal immigrant, even though she had all her papers in order. The hall erupted in cheers when a video of one of the incidents was presented. It showed the same policeman yelling at a young black guy, threatening him with a baton. "People like you are always at fault, even if no one sees it," he was saying. These words echoed through the hall, shocking even those who were ready to defend him to the last. With each new piece of evidence, the atmosphere in court became more and more tense. The police officers, who used to defend their colleague, began to retreat. They couldn't deny the facts. The public exploded. People took to the streets demanding reform. Placards reading "Justice for Aisha" and "No room for racism in the police" filled the city. Aisha sat in her wheelchair, listening to the lawyer expose the system that had allowed this officer to humiliate and harm people for years. Her eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of relief and hope. She knew that the truth was finally coming to light. When the officer was subpoenaed to testify, he looked lost. His confidence was gone. He answered questions with difficulty, his words jumbled. When asked why he threw Lucky off the cliff, he mumbled something about self-defense. But no one in the audience believed those words. The prosecution presented further evidence. His social media correspondence full of racist and discriminatory comments. He called black people lazy, women in wheelchairs a burden, and service dogs a ridiculous luxury for useless people. Those words sounded like a verdict. Aisha looked up at him, her eyes burning with determination. She felt that her voice, her struggle, her love for Lucky had brought her here, to this moment. Now everyone saw the truth. No one could hide behind lies and silence anymore. When the judge called a break, the hall erupted in applause. People stood by Aisha's side, cheering her on. She knew there was still a long way to go, but she also knew that she had already won this fight. The truth had finally seen the light of day, and from now on, no one would be able to ignore it. Aisha sat on a small hillock in the park, watching the sunset that colored the sky in fiery hues. It was the same spot where she had once walked with Lucky. Her wheelchair stood on the grass and she leaned forward slightly, breathing in the cool evening air. It was quiet here, but that silence no longer frightened her. She felt stronger than ever, though the pain of loss still burned her heart. The memory of Lucky was alive in every breeze and every sound she heard. Aisha closed her eyes and his image appeared before her eyes. His golden fur, his soft eyes full of devotion, and the endless love he gave her. Lucky was more than just a dog. He was her friend, her protector, her family. His loss had left a scar that would never heal, but she wasn't going to let that scar break her anymore. After the trial, a lot of things changed. The police officer who destroyed Lucky and tried to break her spirit was fired. His reputation was ruined and his actions became a symbol of what needed to change. But Aisha knew her victory was only a small step in a larger battle. The system that had supported people like this for years was still standing. The people who silently accepted injustice were still taking their places. Her fight was not over. Aisha glanced at the small picture of Lucky she held in her hands. It was their last photo together, taken on a walk just a few days before the tragedy. She smiled through her tears, gently stroking the image of his smiling face. "Lucky, you've always been there for me," she said softly, her voice blending with the sound of the wind. "You taught me that love and loyalty are stronger than anything else. You were my legs when I couldn't walk. You were my light when I felt the darkness. You made me stronger, and I will never forget you." Her voice grew stronger as she continued, addressing not only Lucky, but herself as well. "I promise you I'll keep going. I will not let your death be in vain. No more dogs or people should suffer because of the hatred and cruelty of those who are supposed to protect. We deserve to live in a world where we are respected, whether we are in a wheelchair or not, what color our skin is, or who supports us. This world is what I will fight for." Tears streamed down her face, but they weren't just tears of pain. They were tears of strength and determination. Aisha knew that her story had inspired many. Her voice became the voice of those who had been ignored for too long. People began to see that injustice is not one person's problem. It is a disease that is eating away at society from the inside out. She lifted her head and looked at the sunset. Her heart still ached, but now she knew she could bear any pain. Lucky had given her not only support, but also a lesson. Never give up. She believed that even if he wasn't around, his spirit would always be with her. "You were my hero, Lucky," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Now I'll be yours." Aisha turned her wheelchair around and headed down the path, heading back to her home. There were new battles ahead of her, new challenges, but she was ready. She no longer felt alone. Behind her were the people she had inspired and the memory of Lucky that would always live in her heart. The setting sun illuminated her face, and she smiled. This day was the beginning of something more. Aisha knew she had a long road ahead of her, but now she was ready to walk it. For Lucky's sake, for her own sake, for those who couldn't fight their own battles. After the trial, the cop who dumped Lucky found himself at the center of universal condemnation. His dismissal from the police department was only the first step. Civil lawsuits were filed against him, not only from Aisha, but from other people whose rights he had violated over the years. The public pressure became unbearable, and he was forced to leave town. But that was not the end of it for him. Soon, he was facing criminal charges of abuse of power and animal cruelty. Evidence of his racist and discriminatory actions, presented by Aisha and her team, was key. The court sentenced him to several years in prison and a hefty fine. He was never able to return to police work again, and his name became a symbol of police brutality and systemic racism. Aisha watched the process with a sense of relief. Her struggle not only brought justice for Lucky, but also made many people think about the need for reform. She continued to work with human rights organizations, helping other victims find a voice and advocacy. Her story has inspired thousands of people around the world to fight injustice. Every year on the day Lucky left, Aisha comes to that very park. She sits in her wheelchair on the hill where they once walked together. She brings flowers and a picture of Lucky with her, setting it on a small rock that she has turned into a memorial. This place has become a symbol of her struggle, her love, and her victory over injustice. Aisha and Lucky's story stayed in people's hearts, a reminder that even in the face of the deepest pain and injustice, one should never give up. Lucky's memory lives on, inspiring others to fight for a world where everyone has the right to be heard and protected. We want to know what you think about this story. Write in the comments how you feel after reading it. Has something similar happened in your life? Have there been times when you faced racism, discrimination, or injustice? Your stories are incredibly important to us. They help us understand what each of us is going through and inspire us to keep telling stories that touch on important topics. We appreciate each of you sharing your experiences and your thoughts. You're part of our community, and it's because of you that we keep going. If this story touched you or made you think, please subscribe so you don't miss our other stories. Don't forget to give us a like. It helps us get these stories out to more people. Thank you for being with us. We wish you a good and bright day. Remember that your voices matter, and together we can make the world a better place.